My name is Jeremy and I'm talking to you from the Guildhall Museum in Rochester. Now, this is a video about a man who has had absolutely no impact at all on the collections of the Guildhall Museum, but who we think is so important that he deserves a video all to himself. So, with the help of our colleagues at Medway Archives and a little creative use of the objects at the Guildhall Museum, we'd like to tell you about him. We'd like to tell you about William Cuffay. What makes Cuffay so important? Well, I think there are a number of things. Here is a man who was elected a leader of just about the most important non-parliamentary political organisation of the 19th century. Here is a man who almost throughout his long life fought for freedoms and rights that today we think are essential to our British way of life. Here is a man who was born, grew up and worked in Medway. Here. Here is a man who was black. Cuffay was a black man of dual heritage, and although he was well known during his lifetime, he's been perhaps unjustly neglected in modern accounts of the political history of the early 19th century. So how did Cuffay come to be in Medway? To answer that question, we need to find out a bit more about his parents. Cuffay was the son of a slave. His father grew up in bondage in the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. But at some point in his early life, he earned or won or bought his freedom and travelled with his mother to England, perhaps by paying for their passage by working as a cook on a ship. We know they arrived safely because there they are in the records of St. Mary's Church at Chatham, receiving baptism in the late 18th century. Perhaps it was on this occasion, in celebration of his new life, that William's father first adopted the name of the town where he had arrived. So we know him today as Chatham Cuffay. Now, a few years later, Chatham got married. He married a local woman called Juliana, and there they are in the Register of Marriages at Gillingham Church. I think this is a fascinating document. I've looked at a few records from the 18th and 19th centuries, and again you notice that working people are only able to assert their identity in forms like this by putting a big cross, because without an education, they're not able to write their names. But here you have a man, a freed slave, who has worked his way across half the world. There he is, writing his name in clear, beautiful handwriting, asserting his presence in England. A few years later, they had a son. William was their first. They had at least 5 children. And it wasn't long before William was looking for work. Now, in those days, for a young man, if you wanted to learn a trade, the way to do that was to become an apprentice. So probably about the age of 12, William would have put his name to an indenture paper like this one, which was similarly produced in the late 18th century. William was apprenticed to a firm of tailors in Chatham. Now, of course, being an apprentice for 7 years would have given him the skills that he needed to earn a living. But I think more than that, this apprenticeship gave William an education. The tailors were known to be a particularly radical group. You can see how this might work. Tailoring is, of course, a very physical business, but it's one that happens in quiet. So you can see these men out the back of the shop, sitting cross-legged on the ground, working away, stitching, hour after hour. Their hands busy, but their minds free to wander and their mouths free to talk. They would have talked about wages working conditions, and they talked about politics. This period is a fascinating time for the study of the history of British politics, because the early 19th century is when ordinary people, working people, begin to demand some political representation and access to power. Very few people at this date were entitled to vote. Even after the Great Reform Act of 1832, the franchise was very limited. Women, of course, had their own struggle still to come, and no women were permitted to vote at this time. For men, even after 1832, only about 1 in 7 of the adult male population were able to vote. This was because, to do so, mainly, you needed money to qualify. You needed money to either rent or buy a property to be permitted to register your vote. So, after these 7 years, by the time William moved to London in about 1819, he was ready for action. And he expressed himself in 2 main ways. The first way was in union activity. Now, trade unions were quite a new thing, and joining one could be dangerous. But it was the only way for working people to have hope that they could stand out against the power of their masters and employers. The tailors certainly needed a union because their working conditions in London were very much in decline. In Chatham, William would probably have earned a daily rate, which gave the tailors some sort of security over the course of the year within the seasonal fluctuations of the availability of work. In London, it was different. The masters and employers were encouraging piecework above all. So rather than being paid by the day, tailors were paid by the pieces of work that they completed, which meant that they were inevitably encouraged or pressurized to working longer and longer hours for less and less money to get the work done. And if they objected to these arrangements, increasingly what was happening is that masters and employers were using women and children to do the same work for less money. This culminated in the great strike of the tailors in 1834, where they came out and refused to work. Cuffay joined the strike. It was a disaster. If you were striking in those days, of course you had no work, which meant you had no money, and if you had no money, once you'd run through your savings, you went hungry. So inevitably, bit by bit, the tailors drifted back to work. The most militant, which included Cuffay himself, stayed out as long as they could, but in the end, they all went back, subject to worse conditions that had pertained at the time when they originally went on strike. So perhaps because of this, Cuffay became very disillusioned with trade union activity, and he turned his attention to national politics. He became a Chartist and was elected to the National Executive in 1842. The Chartists were so called because of their support for their charter, which was essentially a kind of petition that was presented to Parliament on 3 separate occasions with a series of 6 demands, which included things like universal male suffrage. They required that every adult man, every man over 21, should be allowed to vote. To that, they added the requirement of the secret ballot. At that date, people voted in public, which exposed them to all kinds of intimidation and threatening behaviour. And thirdly, they asked that MPs should be paid. Because MPs were working on an amateur basis, the only people who were able to do so were, of course, those who had an independent income and could support themselves in other ways, thus denying working people the opportunity to represent any constituency. The Chartist movement culminated in a huge rally in South London in 1848, which Cuffay partly organised and joined. The idea was that this huge mass of working people would march from South London across Westminster Bridge to present their petition in person to Parliament. The British government was absolutely terrified. They packed London with soldiers and armed militia. They feared a revolution like the one which happened in France that very year. Because of this, the Chartist leader, Fergus O'Connor, had secretly come to an agreement with the authorities that he would not lead a march to Parliament, but he would deliver the petition in person by cab. Now, he did this because he was well aware that if it came to a confrontation, the people who were going to get hurt would be the demonstrators. But when the other leaders, including Cuffay, found out about this, they were furious. Cuffay was determined that the demonstrators should force the soldiers into a position where they stopped them marching to Parliament, because he felt if people saw that, then the British government would be associated with illegal force. The petition was delivered, but the march never took place. And really, that was the end of the Chartist movement. They struggled onward for the rest of 1848, but by that time, the organisation was infiltrated by government spies, who were certainly not above encouraging the younger members of the movement to come up with all kinds of outlandish and outrageous plans for a revolution, which they then reported to their government masters. And it was on the evidence of such a government spy that William Cuffay was arrested in 1848 and put on trial the following year for conspiring to levy war against the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain. Throughout his trial, he maintained that the court had no right to try him. He demanded a trial by a jury of his peers, his equals. Now, that was impossible under British law, because in a British court, the jurors had to satisfy a property qualification. They could not, by definition, be working people. They could not, according to William Cuffay, by definition, understand his politics, his life, his point of view. He was convicted along with his other fellow Chartists, and they were all sentenced to transportation for life, which meant they were moved to Wakefield Prison, and then from there they were taken across the world to the British penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, which today we call Tasmania. As it happens, a pardon quickly followed, perhaps because forces within the British government realised that the conviction was unfair and unsound. But having received his pardon, Cuffay decided to stay in Van Diemen's Land. He worked as a tailor and remained active in local politics. He lived there for the rest of his long life, finally dying at the age of 81 or 82 in July 1870, which means that July 2020 is the 150th anniversary of his death. And we salute him, the grandson of a West African slave, the son of a West Indian slave, a man of colour, a man of Medway, a man who stood up for what he believed in, a man who fought for rights and freedoms and democratic processes that still form such an important part of our lives in Britain today.